Oh, and I think if I see it correctly, Nick just dropped out unexpectedly. Maybe he just clicked the wrong button for the screen share. I hope he'll, oh, there he is.
It's a classic case of Zoom's interface leading me to quit rather than to accept the videoing. Thank you very much for that introduction, Robin. Can you possibly enable my screen sharing? And then I might share some slides with everybody. But just while you're doing that, I'll start off by saying thank you very much for welcoming us here. So this connection came about after Marcus and I wrote a story that sort of brings together a small Pacific Island nation called Tuvalu and climate change and technology. And I'm going to sort of tell the story about how those things come together and pull on one thread and then hand over to Marcus, who will pull on a different thread. And then we can sort of see which threads everyone here wants to pull on and hopefully have a good chat about these topics. I am now able to share screen. So there we go. So that is the article that we started with, and we'll sort of come back to that. I want to start off by acknowledging the traditional owners, the Turrbal and the Yagara, who are the traditional owners of the land where I'm standing here now, and also the traditional owners of the land that my university is on. And I want to pay my respect to their elders, laws, customs, and creation spirits. And as I mentioned, we're talking about the island nation of Tuvalu. Out of curiosity, has anyone here been to Tuvalu? I'm not expecting many yeses. It's actually recognized as one of the least visited places on Earth. You can sort of see from the part of the map we're looking at quite how remote it is. It's got about 13,000 citizens and 9 islands, and they are all exceptionally beautiful like this one. Just to give you a sense of the place, Tuvalu. It's kind of tropical paradise, but with the problem that, as you may have predicted, with rising sea levels, it's in serious danger of becoming uninhabitable to humans. So, as I'm sure everyone in the room is well aware, sea level rising is real, and the prediction is that sometime within the next sort of 50 to 100 years, Tuvalu is going to become uninhabitable, in the sense of humans can't live in islands like this if, at certain times of the year, there are storm surges and swells that damage infrastructure and that make it so that the fresh water on the island doesn't work for those citizens. So they're in serious existential danger. And I just want to take a moment to connect with the fact that this is a place with a people, and there's a culture here. Tuvalu has its own language. It has thousands of years of history, and all of that is in danger because the land is in danger of going underwater, and floods already happen regularly enough. And as I say, 50 to 100 years is the prediction. So the question then that I have for you, the provocation, is what do you do if you're perhaps the leader of a nation state and you know that your territory is going to cease to be inhabitable by your citizens? What reaction would you take? This is 13,000 people and you're a leader. You've got to come up with some kind of a response to this. So so Simon Coffey, this is Simon Coffey. He's the Minister for Foreign Affairs and for Culture. And he gave an address at COP26. And so I should say, please do jump into the chat if you've got any questions or want any clarifications as I'm going. I'm just going to assume you know what I'm talking about with acronyms and such things otherwise. So COP26, which is the gathering of leaders around climate, trying to address climate change, trying to mitigate its effects, and was basically able to get everybody's attention with a video address where he was standing thigh deep in water and saying, hey, we really need to sort this stuff out because this situation with the water rising, which was very effective in getting the media's attention. But sadly, COP26 wasn't so effective in actually addressing climate change. And then so COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, he had a different announcement where it was a video address, much like the first one. And he was standing on a beach in Tuvalu. And as the video went on, and Simon Coffey is making his plea to the world about adapting to climate change, it became apparent that the beach that he was addressing them from was actually a digital representation of Tuvalu. And part of the policy that he was describing was that one way that he, as a leader in Tuvalu, was responding to the climate crisis and the existential threat of climate change was to create a digital replica of Tuvalu in the metaverse, amongst a few other responses. But what was, well, so this is kind of the crux of the story, is that Tuvalu has this policy of how they are dealing with climate change. So they've got sort of 3 planks in their policy. One of those is to try and influence the world through diplomacy, through their cultural values, and to basically stop climate change in every way they can. So they've been leading the charge in a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, getting nations to sign on to say, we will not proliferate fossil fuels. Second one of these policies is about international recognition of statehood, getting people to recognize that their maritime boundaries will persist, even if people stop living on the island, and that they continue to be a state. And we'll come back to some of these later. But this third one is what everyone focused on, which was that they're creating a digital replica of the island, and that there's going to be some digital government administration and some other things that they were going to make digital. So perhaps somewhat predictably, the world's media kind of took that one part of the story and ran with it for the most part. You know, Tuvalu turns to Metaverse to guarantee its existence, or these are just representative. Could a digital twin of Tuvalu preserve the island nation before it's lost to the collapsing climate? So what I find interesting about this is that this is all kind of following the formula that the media has around covering technology. This is what they do. When something happens in technology, they say, what is it? And they try and explain it. And then they say, what will happen if it's huge? There's not often this pause to say, hang on, do we want that? Is that a good idea? And so it was the case here. And so this was the moment where I feel like there's a collision of Tuvalu happens to be the place where this is happening. It's at the front line of climate change. That's why we're focused on Tuvalu, because that's the place that's going underwater. And they're looking to technology as a way to try and address that. Clearly, anything that they do is justified because they're in this situation through no fault of their own. So I'm entirely supportive of everything that they and Simon Coffey is doing. But for me, it's really interesting as a jumping off point to talk about 2 different stories here. And so one of them, and this is the part that Marcus is going to focus on, is about technology and climate change. So what I find really interesting is that the company that's actually building the digital replica of Tuvalu is Accenture, who some of you might know as one of the world's larger consulting firms. And they also do consulting for a lot of the world's biggest polluters. And so it's quite interesting that then they do this, I think, pro bono creating of Tuvalu as a digital copy. So that's the side of the story that Marcus is going to focus on. Today, I thought I'd just raise a few things about the other side of the story and see what you find interesting about this idea of nations going digital is how the news is often talking about it. What is this idea of technology plus a nation? Because there seems to be one narrative about, what will this allow nations to do? But I think the more interesting side of it is how might it change our idea of what a nation is and what does it mean in terms of connections to place? But I'm using up a lot of my time already, so I'll get on with it. So this is a useful definition of nation, basically just because it accentuates three things. It notes that there's territory matters to a nation. It talks about common culture, common past, common project. Let's just call all of that culture. And this discussion of right to rule itself, let's just talk about that under the banner of sovereignty. And I will start off by saying there are probably people here who are political scientists. I'm not. My focus is more coming from the technology side, but this overlap is a really interesting space. So let's provoke that discussion. So let's start talking about territory here, because we're all probably most used to the idea of a nation having territory in the form of a Westphalian nation state. So, we're all familiar with, I was thinking about what image of a map to use, and I'm sure we all interact with Google Maps far more often than any other kind of map. And we're used to this kind of representation where each country is a shape on a map, and they're all equal units that have equal sovereignty over the territory contained within a shape. And it's often forgotten that this is a very recent idea, sometime within the last few hundred years, and also that these maps hide other conceptions of territory and of geography. So I find this thoroughly interesting, that this is a map created by Stanford representing sovereignty in the Roman Empire, where sovereignty was not about these uniform units where each country has sovereignty over territory. It's about a big territory, and the distance that you are from the center, in this case Rome, gives the degree of sovereignty they have over you. So these are two different representations of the same map, just to give you a bit of a sense of where we're talking about. So, we've got London there and Carthage and so on. And of course, we could do the same thing, talk about, this is, apologies for the small image, a representation of Greek city-states as points, and that being a different representation. So let's juxtapose those with this map of the internet, where we've got each of these circles represents a continent as a landmass, and the lines connecting the nodes, which jump between continents, are the internet connections. So these are the undersea cables connecting Europe to the Americas and to Australia and to the rest of the world. And this is a different way of representing the idea of sovereignty. So this is something that Benjamin Bratton talks about in his book, The Stack, that I found made a really compelling argument for this idea of nation states moving from territory as something that sits within a shape on a map, everyone having these units, to the idea of what's a network structure, and a nation has sovereignty over the things that it connects to through these fingers. And where I use the word fingers as in the cables or wires or whatnot. So you'll see on the slide, I've got platform sovereignty. So we're probably familiar with the idea of nation states in our world, and nation states, this is kind of society that we're used to, have markets within them, and they're two different institutions that we're quite familiar with that kind of have separate roles within a society. And the nation state has sovereignty over the territory, and they have a relationship with markets, and these institutions play a certain role. On the other side, I've got platforms there, because the argument that Bratton is making is that platforms have a different kind of sovereignty, but they take on some of the attributes of each of the institutions of nation states and markets. So if you were to think about the fact that there are some platforms in people's lives that have more control over what they're able to do each day than the government of the land that they're living on. So, you know, an example of a platform might be Amazon as a very well-known one that has a lot of influence on people's lives. But let's take another couple of examples of Estonia is a country in the traditional sense, but they offer something called e-citizenship, which allows people who have never set foot in the territory to become a part of Estonia as a citizen. And so then we see Estonia taking on some of these characteristics of being a sovereign platform rather than a sovereign nation, as well as. And from the other direction, we've got something like Second Life, which some of you may have heard of. Basically, it's an online space, 3D virtual immersive world, where you're able to become an avatar and have a whole life in this virtual landscape. There are a lot of video games like, you know, World of Warcraft or Fortnite. They've all got this common characteristic of you spend time in a virtual landscape. But this is all, so this is, you know, one possible direction. We're happy to talk more about any of these. Bringing it all back, we started off talking about the fact that, you know, Tuvalu is hit by climate change, is responding by going online and, you know, creating a digital replica of itself, and that they're trying to preserve their territory, and that they're trying to keep a memory of the actual place and keep their culture alive by creating a virtual place. And a lot of the stories that are responding to this are saying, hey, what would a digital nation look like? And this takes the idea of a nation as if it's something that's set in stone. And it's sort of saying, oh yeah, how is the nation going to make use of this digital technology? But I'm almost more interested in this story of how might platform sovereignty change the nation state? And as designers, this is the real question for me, is how could we design the uses of perhaps platform sovereignty as opposed to something that is connected to an actual place? Does it even make sense to talk about a nation that doesn't have a place? Maybe there are opportunities here to divide things that were previously taken together that perhaps don't have to be taken together. Perhaps culture and territory are things that might want to be connected more naturally, but other things such as, say, the functions of a state, some of those functions might be able to be done through a platform and have zero connection to place, and which belong on which side of this divide. So that's my provocation. Many thanks, Marcus, for adding the notes there as I went. I'm gonna stop sharing and hand over to you now.
Awesome. Thank you, Nick, and also Robin for hosting us, and everyone for your attendance. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the Agra and Turrbal. I'm also here in Brisbane at the moment, where they're also the traditional owners of the lands where I'm talking to you from. Now, one interesting tidbit that I might just quickly add in as a kind of seg into my part of the presentation is that when we published this op-ed, this commentary piece in the Conversation about Tuvalu. I think you might have seen there, it has this byline about this hidden message in the bottle. We thought it was like a bit of a tongue-in-cheek analogy, that it's actually our main point of writing this op-ed wasn't about the metaverse, which is the whole irony of what Nick was alluding to, that all these other journalists contacted us for interviews and quotes and presentations, and they were all fascinated about this idea that a nation is disappearing, and all of a sudden, like the phoenix out of ashes, it's reborn in the digital space, when we didn't write about that at all. So it just kind of comes to show that none of these journalists actually read what we wrote. But the minister did. So we were really pleased when Simon Colby tweeted and said, "Oh, well done finding the hidden message in the bottle." And so I'll send you those links, because I thought that was quite cute, and probably is a benefit or like a peculiarity or particular quality of having such a small nation, that actually reaching the minister is super easy, because it's like such a small nation. There's only a handful of people. I actually already feel that way in Australia. It's usually like, 2 degrees of separation to reach anyone in Australia compared to other parts of the world. So these are the tweets from the time, both the minister as well as his ministry, which is probably just his other account that he has on his phone. They, in a way, endorsed us finding this hidden message. And so I want to unpack this part a little bit further, which is actually that the hidden message is a bit about a critique of our belief that technology will fix all our problems. So I'm just gonna go here into the presentation. Okay, is this coming through? Great. So I got 3 provocations here, and they're all, in a way, I suppose, starting points for discussion about the role of technology, because a lot of the time, and Nick already alluded to this, technology is seen as a bit of a panacea that is there to fix our problems, to make our lives easier, to look at these kinds of wicked situations we find ourselves in. And then a lot of industry and government find it quite convenient to suggest that there will be an engineering solution, a technological fix. So the first provocation is about efficiency. And I've called this "efficiency gains ain't gonna cut it." Efficiency, in particularly a very neoliberal kind of policy discourse that is happening in my research area, predominantly, that's smart cities, digital twins, urban data analytics. Efficiency is like the prime concern. It's about optimizing our data intake in order to analyze and produce insights, and those insights then drive efficiencies, which is a very kind of industrial way of thinking, right? So it's like this Fordian conveyor belt notion that we are trying to, in essence, apply business process management optimization to not just businesses, but everything in the world. So for instance, in my field of urbanism and urban informatics, a couple of years ago, the notion of efficiency has been introduced to the thinking of urban planning, urban design, urban governance, urban policymaking. And the elected representatives of cities, of municipalities, were in essence told by the big 4 accounting firms that they should stop treating cities like cities. They should treat cities like corporations. And what that would do is open up an entire ready-made portfolio of services and consultancy advice that these consultancy companies could just regurgitate from the 70s and 80s and resell it to cities as their new clients. And that's now been done for quite a number of years under this banner of the smart city. Connecting this to sustainability, the smart city agenda has also been very much used in order to say that cities are becoming greener, they're becoming more sustainable, they're doing something about climate change. And so the examples that we then see as the physical, tangible representations of what that means, they sometimes look like this. This is a particular example from Milano, a city in northern Italy. I did a visiting professorship there at the Politecnico di Milano. And the building that you see there is the Bosco Verticale, which means the vertical forest. It's a multi-award winning building that obviously, as you can see in this picture, is quite unique. Well, maybe not so anymore because it's been replicated in various ways. But the unique kind of feature there is that mature sized trees are growing on its facade, kind of picked it all the way around these balconies. And so we had a cohort of Master of Design, of Service Design students, and I took them there for a bit of an excursion. I also got in trouble flying the drone because this photo was taken from my drone, and then I got the security guards come after us immediately. Apparently, it's a big no-no to take this photo, but I've kept it anyway. So the interesting thing about this building is that it is green in its appearance, but when we dig further, it's not quite as green as you might think. So whilst this idea of green architecture and green cities suggests that when it looks green, it actually contributes to climate change outcomes, etc., that may not actually be the case. So for instance, some of the problems we uncovered. First, pest control. So the fact that you have this forest actually also means that wildlife really, really likes this. And so there is pigeons, there's rats, there's cockroaches, there's spiders, there's a whole bunch of creepy crawlies that are part of a forest, but they're no part of the building. And so this doesn't easily gel with the quite upper end society residents that live in this high-rise building. And so whilst there is this notion of having a forest, they are also constantly applying pest control and pesticides. The residents that live there, they're not allowed to touch the trees because touching a tree is an insurance risk. So the tree could fall off the balcony if it's malnourished, if it's not properly secured. And so the residents are under strict instructions not to touch the forest, not to touch the tree. So you kind of imagine you're living in your apartment, but this greenery on the outside, don't touch. And so at the end of the day, when you do an assessment of the actual climate impact or the ecological footprint or the carbon footprint, you actually start to wonder, is this really just greenwashing? Is it just a paying lip service to a commitment to environmental sustainability? So this is just kind of for us as an opener to start thinking about this. We've written about this a little bit further in this article that is co-authored with a couple of colleagues from our architecture school. And this is looking at a more than human perspective on the understanding the performance of the built environment. What we are doing in here is looking at the kinds of models that are used in the built environment. And here is a graphic or an illustration from this article. On the left, you see some of these international frameworks. There is the LEED model, which I think is really popular in the US. In Australia, we have the Green Star Building Framework. There's BREEAM, there's Living Building Challenge, and there's others. But what we found in our analysis is that a lot of these frameworks have a common denominator around efficiencies, in this case, energy efficiency. So they're trying to say the building has to be efficient in its usage, in its consumption. Now, we then juxtapose this in this argument with what the IPCC wants, which is on the right side, because they're not just asking for a couple of percentages to be shaved off our consumption. The IPCC is asking us to maintain our carbon footprint, to maintain 1.5 degrees of warming, which actually requires not just efficiency gains, but absolute reductions, net decrease of consumption. We are talking about net zero and increasingly the notion of net positive or climate positive commitments. And you can see that there's a gap between the two. This is another way of looking at it. So this is a graph that shows the energy footprint of buildings in Australia, and they are split across different sectors. And whilst these different frameworks have constantly increased the efficiency of the single building, you can see from 2009 to 2020, the footprint still goes up. And that's because we're building more buildings because there's more people. And so the absolute footprint, when you move away from just talking about relatives and we move away from the single building that has managed to win a 4-star or 5-star rating, we still face this prospect of accelerating our drive towards the planetary ecocide. And so the technology innovation that is being introduced into the space of efficiencies and smart cities, that is in essence not sufficient. It's not enough in order to turn things around. So this is, in economics terms, is called the rebound effect, or the Kazum-Brooks postulate, or in this case, the Jevons paradox. Technological progress or government policy that increases the efficiency with which a resource is used, but the rate of the consumption of that resource rises due to the increasing demand that that could bestow. The second provocation comes closer to our shared field. Nick and I are in the School of Design, and so we practice human-centered design quite often, and I've been subscribed to a notion of user-led design, human-centered design for quite a long time, and that came about as a response to very early days of my undergraduate degree where I did computer science. And so in that experience, it was very technologically centered. We looked at technical innovation, hardware and software, different applications, what can the internet do? And then the human often came second. And so it was a natural response to then embrace human-centered design, to say, hang on a minute, we first want to understand what's the human context here. We want to do user studies. We want to understand the problem space, the opportunity space, and then look at technology as a means to an end, as an enabler, as a solution, as providing opportunities. But we increasingly now, more recently, we formed a group that is problematizing this as well. And I give you this example of a coffee cup. So this is a great example of a human-centered design, because when you look at it, it's lightweight, it feels good in your hand, it holds the coffee in there without that you burn your hands. The plastic lid on there means that you can carry it around without spilling it. It has a nice soft groove so that your lips feel nice when you wrap your lips around it and drink the coffee. It has a nice perforation that enables the air to escape so that the coffee is easy to drink from it, etc., etc. So there's so much thought that over the years went into the industrial design of coffee cups, which is now advanced probably to be a very mundane item. So contrast this with this little graphic, which is already a couple of years old. This is the paper cups montage from 2008. And it shows, this is already quite a number of years ago, 410,000 paper cups, which equals the number of disposable hot beverage paper cups that are used in the United States alone every 15 minutes. So whilst we have now embraced this very human-centered design that is very convenient for humans, it's safe to use, it makes humans happy to buy more coffee, we are not necessarily putting into the equation of that human-centered design the same, I suppose, attention to the ecological footprint. Whilst it is increasingly happening, what we are suggesting we might have to do is move away from just a human-centeredness approach. And so one of the most stark provocations is here by Mike Montero, who says the world is working exactly as designed, and it's not working very well, which means we need to do a better job of designing it. In his book, Ruined by Design, How Designers Destroyed the World, What Can We Do to Fix It? In, again, my field of cities and urbanism and smart cities, my colleague Laura Folano wrote this really good piece that was published in Design Issues, where she talks about decentering the human in the design of collaborative cities. And when she published this, just the title was really quite gobsmacking to many people in the field, because it was kind of like heresy. What, decentering the human? That sounds like the complete opposite of what we want to do. But she offered a very profound argument of why this has merits and why it makes sense. The idea really in a nutshell is that human-centered design, especially if it's encapsulated in a neoliberal commercial framework that is about selling shit, it puts the human at the top of the pyramid. Everything else comes secondary. And in essence, is actually what even comes above that is the commercial and the economic kinds of objectives and outcomes. And so what Laura and now others in this more than human turn are trying to argue for is a move towards a life-centered design, which embraces planetary health and well-being. So the human is actually put into an ecosystem perspective where we are not the pinnacle and epitome of existence, but we actually need to recognize that we share this place. And the third provocation is around science and technology itself won't be sufficient to fix climate change. Now, there is others, and this is not my invention. So there's a lot of commentary, and I'm pointing just to this one example as a good go-to kind of starting point of commentary that has engaged quite critically with this notion of the role of science and technology in the climate emergency. But in essence, we're looking at the footprint of the technology itself, as well as what we are, in a way, forgetting by embracing this technical focus. So in this particular case, this was recent research published in an article in Nature. It makes a forecast that by 2025, everything online, the internet, online transactions, banking, IoT devices, blockchain, it will consume 20% of humanity's electricity and energy footprint, which is not that far away, and we might even reach it sooner. This is footage from investigative journalists that produced an article for the Washington Post, and they are been following these miners that are operating in the Congo, and they are digging up cobalt, which is used for lithium-ion batteries, which we all now these days carry around in different quantities, whether it's a phone, a tablet, a laptop, or even your electric vehicle, which would have far more copious amounts of cobalt embedded in its batteries. And so whilst we might believe that the move towards electric vehicles is a very sustainable move, in essence, it's actually shifting the problem elsewhere. So we are depleting rare earth metals. We are encouraging child slavery and child labor in these areas that are unregulated. And we are also then facing the problem on the other side of the supply chain and the life cycle chain, which is electronic waste. So I'm going to quickly, I might have to reshare this to optimize the video, show you this video from Ghana in Accra, and it's the electronic waste dump site, and it's just like a 1-minute clip that I wanted to share with you. Just give me 1 second.
So we are here at the Agbogbloshie electronic waste dump site, indeed the biggest electronic waste dump site in Africa, I'd say. This is where electronic waste, television sets, computers, microwaves, refrigerators from most developed countries end up. Then you find kids, some as young as 5, 6, 7, 8, coming here to dismantle, to break open these electronic waste just to salvage metals such as copper. They sell these things to buy food, they use some of the money to buy food, and they give some money to their parents, and some would use part of the money to buy whatever they need to go to school.
The boys who are engaged in the burning inhale the fumes that come out of it, and that bioaccumulates certain hard toxics in their body. In our bid to ascertain that impact, we conducted the blood analysis of about 49 of these recyclers. The results revealed that the accumulation of lead in these boys are above the required standards, which is health threatening.
So what this video just illustrates is yet again not the actual tackling of sustainability and climate change action through technology, but the way that we contain, for instance, the problem into a what industry or what government might believe is a containable and manageable area, the city. the household, the car, mobility. But what we forget in this kind of very compartmentalized view is that these things are connected. So where do the rare earth metals come from that go into the inverter that will run your solar panels? Where does the cobalt come from that will drive your battery in your electric vehicle? So all of this is kind of accumulating to this notion of technological solutionism, that we believe in the support of STEM, of science, technology, engineering, and maths, as the saviors that will get us out of this traffic jam. As for instance here in this depiction, that rather than actually understanding the causes of congestion, we just try and find technological fixes, whether it's road widening projects or whether it's, you know, driving above the traffic jam. And so the commentators that have critically responded to this, these are two pieces that I particularly like because they're very accessible. This is already from a couple of years ago in The Guardian. Neoliberalism has conned us into fighting climate change as individuals. A lot of the focus, for instance, in our field of design has long been on behavioral psychology, on nudging theory, on persuasiveness, right? So you make individual consumption choices in the supermarket. Are you gonna go for the vegetarian meal? Are you gonna get the beef burger? Are you gonna get the paper-based straw, or are you gonna get the plastic-based straw? And so whilst these are important decisions, it actually conveniently shifts attention away from much larger frameworks of governance and decision-making that corporations have at their disposal, as well as nation states and the departments and institutional entities within nation states. So if McDonald's makes a decision to phase out caged eggs and embrace organic free-range eggs, that will have an impact across the entire world in one hit, rather than me opting to refrain from my individual consumption choice. And so these two things have to go hand in hand. This article is also quite eye-opening why a hipster, vegan, green tech economy is not sustainable. It was published in Al Jazeera a couple of years ago. So I'll leave you with a couple of pointers for those interested in our work. We've started a group that Nick and I are part of at QUT, a research group on more than human futures, that is looking at particularly these kinds of issues. We are looking at it from both a environmental humanities point of view, from a design point of view, when we also have a lot of colleagues from the School of Creative Practice that are coming from an arts and performance and creative practice background. And so some of the works in there, for instance, look at, in this case, the kinds of light and media facade installations in cities and what impact they have on nocturnal life, on animals, on plant life. We've been conceptualizing smart cities in a different way to try and evade urban ecocides. In this particular piece that was published in the Journal of Urban Technology, we've done some quite fun experiments in academic workshops. This one here is in Belgium, in Ghent, as part of the Participatory Design Conference, where we've been assuming the role of urban co-inhabitants, of urban wildlife, and try and do an assessment of the city from a different point of view, of trying to assume the role of a bird, trying to assume the role of a honeybee. This then led to this article more recently with colleagues at the University of Sydney, where I've been talking about non-human personas as a way to come up with different methods to include nature in the design of cities. And with Nick and a colleague at UQ's, Dr. Sky Doherty, we've been fortunate to get this piece accepted, which is talking about the dark side of creativity, which is about looking at some of the way creativity is used in the built environment to bring out much more nefarious kinds of outcomes. And this has a direct connection and relation with sustainability, because oftentimes corporations that engage in greenwashing use very creative methods to get around regulation, to cut the red tape, to get what they want, to build the toxic waste plant or whatever it is that they're wanting, the new runway at the airport. And we've been trying to dissect the kinds of ways creativity is at play in order to unlock these kinds of regulatory hurdles when they're actually there in the first place to protect communities and to protect the environment. So I'll leave you with this, and I hope that in terms of the time available, I think we do have plenty of time for some questions and answers and some discussion. But yeah, thank you very much for tuning in today, and I'll pass back to Robin.
Thanks, Marcus. Thank you, Nick. Indeed, we have time for questions. So please, if anyone from the audience has a question, just raise your hand and parry forth. Ben, go ahead.
Thanks for a wonderful talk. I've never been to Australia, so maybe I'm the exception among all of you. I wanted to first mention my colleague. I'm in religious studies, more specifically, I study Buddhism. And my colleague, Jeff Nicolaisen, works on, in Taiwan, there's this push for an amendment to the Constitution which would have equality of life mentioned in the Constitution, which would mean that non-human personas, as the last part of your presentation, would actually need to be considered as legal entities. I can forward his contact information later, and he's giving a talk soon. And so I think that might be a good connection to make. I mean, I wonder more broadly, I think, can you speculate? So one tool perhaps to think about a post-anthropocentric future in my discipline has obviously been conceptions of religion that's decenter the human as in control of his destiny and put forth a different cosmology, right? Especially non-monotheistic religions seem to have this. And so I wondered whether you could just speak broadly about how you see